Yeah.
I think so.
I don't know if you can hear on the mic or not. I didn't think so. Okay, is that better? No. Anybody know any good jokes?
I can never remember them.
Oh, it looks like ours are working.
Yeah.
Why do you think I've been quiet?
That would work.
Hello. Okay. Welcome to the Dole Institute. I'm Bill Lacey, the director. We're delighted to have you here tonight for our every semester Student Advisory Board program. I want to start tonight by asking everybody to turn off their cell phones. The director is known to get very upset when cell phones go off during programs. And if you haven't been here before, the way we do Q&A is at the end of the discussion tonight when Claire asks for questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand. A student worker will come by with a cordless microphone so you can ask your question. Please ask just one brief question, no statements. Now, for those of you who come regularly to our programs, you're used to seeing a student welcome at the beginning of every program. And I think most of you probably have figured out by this point that no, I'm not a student, but that this is a different program. We do this once every semester. One of the things that we've tried to do at the Dole Institute is create a unique student culture. And we have our Student Advisory Board that is our governing body here at the Dole Institute for students. They participate in all our activities. They get a chance to meet all of our guests who come through and get special opportunities. And I want to right now ask all the members of the Student Advisory Board to please stand up. Okay, please recognize them. Thank you, guys. We're very proud of the student culture we've built here, and it's something that has taken an extended period of time, but it's been really growing a lot lately, so we are very excited about it. I get the special opportunity tonight to introduce our moderator and interviewer. Claire Michkowski has served as our Student Advisory Board coordinator this year, but Claire has been part of the Dole Institute for 4 years. She's done a fantastic job for us, and she received on Sunday, for those of you who haven't heard, the very first awarding of a very prestigious student award, the Robert J. Dole Service to Country Award. Claire received that. And it comes with a very nice monetary grant, which I'm sure Claire will have a good use for. So everyone, please welcome to introduce our guests and run tonight's program, SAB Coordinator Claire Michkowski.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming out tonight. We're fortunate to have two great guests, Jessica from the Center for Immigration Studies and Michael, who is an immigration lawyer in Kansas City. I think it's best when people introduce themselves, so if you could give a little bit of background, that would be great.
Sure. My name is Jessica Vaughan, and as Claire said, I've been with the Center for Immigration Studies since 1992, and I cover the operational side of the immigration issue especially visa programs and immigration benefits programs and immigration enforcement. And our organization is a research institute that studies the impact of immigration on American society. And our research has led us to conclude that many of our immigration policies today are not serving our national interest and have some significant downsides for certain Americans. And so we work to educate Congress and the public with fact-based research on immigration issues. Before I joined the center, I was a consular officer with the U.S. Department of State, and that's how I got interested in the migration issue. I live in New England now, and I am a mom of 4 kids.
Michael.
I'm Michael Sharma-Crawford. I don't think I have a mic, but that's okay. My wife and I run an immigration firm in Kansas City, and in 2011, 2012, we started a nonprofit. As you may or may not know, that immigrants in removal proceedings have to provide their own counsel. They have no access to public counsel, or there's no counsel appointed for them. So there was no services for low bono or pro bono service for non-citizens in the Kansas City area, or in fact, west of Springfield, Missouri. The immigration court in Kansas City serves both all of Missouri and all of Kansas. So we started a nonprofit. It has 1 attorney. It runs about 170, 180 cases a year, and has been in operation since 2012. Beyond that, we are known for aggressive litigation in the immigration defense area. We, in 2015, took a case that went to the Supreme Court and back. And if you are a Lawrence, Kansas resident, then you've seen my wife's handiwork with the case of Professor Jamal. So beyond that, that's kind of what we do.
Okay, I'll go ahead and get into my first question. And I think you addressed this a little bit, but I was hoping you would both talk about your views on America's current immigration laws, where we stand today.
Well, we haven't had any major immigration reforms in probably since about 1990 especially that covered legal immigration. Our research has shown that our immigration policies are not now working very well in the national interest. Americans cherish our tradition of immigration, and immigration is a huge benefit to our country in general. But the current levels of immigration and the makeup of our legal immigration system and the size of our guest worker programs, each year we bring in about a million legal immigrants and about 700,000 guest workers on temporary visas, and somewhere around 400,000 or 500,000 people are settling in the country illegally each year. And that level of immigration is causing problems for some Americans. For a long time, our immigration policy was made, when I started, it was made primarily by a small group of members of Congress and heavily influenced by representatives of special interest groups that benefited tremendously from immigration. But like any policy, immigration has costs and benefits, and there are winners and losers in our policy. And right now, I think there are too many, the laws are not well serving our national interest, and it's not working well for Americans, and in some cases not well for immigrants either. And so we would support an overhaul of our immigration law in some ways, and particularly what we would like to see is a trimming of some of our legal immigration categories, particularly some of the, right now we get about 2/3 of our legal immigration is based on family sponsorship. And we'd like to see that trim back some categories like a lottery that brings in about 50,000 people a year, and revise our employment-based immigration system to be based more on a merit system, with people not just people who are sponsored by companies, but people who have something, are well educated and have skills that are needed in our country. So, and overall, the numbers reduced, and especially address the problem of illegal immigration, which has proven very costly for a lot of communities around the country.
Michael?
Wow, we agree. We agree that the system is corrupt, and I don't mean that you pay $20 and you get something done, but corrupt in the same way you can't open a PDF because the file's corrupted. The immigration law began in, thank you. The immigration law began in 1952, where all of the different acts were codified into one constant theme. The problem is it adopted the view of that time. So if we think of 1952, the nuclear family, patriarchal society, you're still in that concept. When you have an immigration system, for example, that cannot accurately define the term admission or admitted, you have a problem. That would be the fundamental core principle of your Immigration Act, is who is admitted or who will be admitted, or what is admission to the United States. And if your law does not accurately define that and cannot, you have a problem, and we do. We may differ on the effect of that. We may differ on what's the right way to get it done, but the current law as it stands now is corrupted, and it is non-functional, sort of like that. And I think it would take a national referendum, and I don't know that we're going to get there because it's become so politicized, and it is so full of sound bites and buzzwords and all of this that detract from an actual discussion about what we want and what we need. So if anybody is in here from Western Kansas, you're going to have a completely different view about what you need from an immigration system than someone who is from Johnson County, just in the state of Kansas alone. And I think that analysis has to begin at that grassroots level before we can get anywhere successfully.
Okay, Michael, we'll start with you on this question. How do current policies affect immigrants attempting to gain citizenship?
Okay, that's a loaded question. So let's, I mean, because I'm the lawyer, so I'm listening to terms and I'm saying, okay, specific words have specific meaning. So let's back up. Let's do away with a couple of phrases that we're all used to saying, like path to citizenship. Let's throw that away. Let's take that out of our nomenclature and pitch it. There is no path to citizenship. It doesn't exist. That's not the thing. To become a citizen of the United States, you either have to acquire citizenship because your parents naturalized, or you were born to a citizen, or you were born in the United States, or you apply to become a citizen of the United States. You naturalize. And aside from the Manby program and the military avenues for citizenship, the most common path to citizenship is to become a permanent resident of the United States. So if you're going to look at immigration and the path and the ways that affect folks in the United States or intending immigrants who want to become citizens, then what you're affecting is the path to residency. And once you've cleaned up the path to residency, the path to citizenship follows. 5 years of residency coupled with 5 years of good moral character and 5 years of physical presence and residing in the United States is your, quote, path to citizenship. That's how you become a citizen. So if we don't have a clear way to allow people into the United States, or who can get on a path to become citizens or to become residents, that's going to be the downfall. If you take the DACA program, a very uncontroversial program in the United States, you've got kids who are in the United States who are Americans in the sense of people, if you read old legal cases from the 1800s about what the concept of citizenship was. But they have no path to residency if you just look at the DACA program in and of itself. There are ways for them to get on a particular track, but that program itself doesn't give them that path to residency. So if you're going to create avenues for citizenship, you're going to create avenues for residency.
Jessica, you want to talk about that?
Sure. I think I would disagree with you, actually, respectfully. I think that the law does provide a clear path to citizenship for those who have been admitted as legal immigrants. And it's something that people can choose or not choose. I I think our immigration policy is failing in some ways because I don't think we promote citizenship enough. I think one of the goals of our immigration policy should be to make new citizens, not just people who have come here to live here for a better life or a better job, or to join family members. I think we should be trying to have an immigration system that brings in people who want to become Americans, and I think that makes our country stronger. They can come from anywhere, any walk of life, any circumstances, and meet that criteria, I think. Under our Constitution, Congress is responsible for making our immigration laws so that we have one federal immigration law. And Congress decides through our messy legislative process what categories of immigrants we're going to admit, and in what number. And I think there's a lot of tweaking that definitely could be done to that, as I said earlier, but I do think we have a good system in that, you know, once you qualify, not everyone in the world can qualify. In one sense, everyone could, but not everyone can. We take immigrants from everywhere, but you have to qualify. You have to have a family member sponsor, or qualify with certain skills, or be admitted as a refugee, or win the visa lottery. And all of those individuals, when they're admitted and come in on a green card, as it's known, as long as they maintain good moral character, which basically means don't get convicted of a serious crime, they are eligible to become citizens. And what I think is a shame is that not everyone does. I mean, I can understand why some immigrants don't want to become citizens because they feel that they're still citizens of their home country. But I would like to see us do more to encourage people to become citizens. And I do think that we need to maintain a distinction, though, between citizenship and people who are permanent residents. And there needs to be a difference. And I think that difference is mainly has to do with the privilege of voting.
Michael, would you like to respond, or?
I mean, I can't take away too much in the sense that the Mexican consulate in Kansas City promotes citizenship. They push, they know how many eligible lawful permanent residents are of Mexican descent that they deal with. They push them to become citizens of the United States. The citizenship process in the United States is becoming more arduous in practice, in the sense that if you think about moving through the system, when you get to citizenship, your file gets taken apart page by page, and they're going back through that file to make sure that there's nothing wrong, or you haven't lied, or you haven't done anything wrong in the back. And that's fair. I don't have a problem with that. But it becomes a more onerous system. Right now, it takes about 6 months from the filing till you are finished with the interview process, and you're going to have an oath ceremony in a couple of months. And they do encourage it. They do citizenship processes at Sporting KC, at the soccer fields, and wherever, to encourage that to occur. But I think the idea that we're this wide open country, that anyone, I love that phrase, anybody can come here and become a resident. No, we can't. Absolutely not. We have a system that is limited in the way it looks. At Folks, it's limited in the way it allows people in. It's antiquated in its view, and it's not responsive to the population that exists in the United States. We look at the family-based immigration system. You have brothers and sisters of Mexican nationals, or the adult children of Mexican nationals, whether that person is a citizen of the United States filing for their adult children, or a resident filing for their adult children. You're looking at processes that are 30 and 40 years long. It's just not going to happen. That process is essentially stagnant, and you're not going to get those people here. So we have to deal with that question of how we're going to do that before we ever decide that we're going to move forward. But yes, the encouragement of folks to become citizens of the United States, absolutely. I think that's a process that should occur and something people should be proud of.
And I guess my question for you, Jessica, is what could we be doing to encourage more citizenship that we're not already doing?
You know, I think that part of the problem is that many of the institutions that during a previous great wave of immigration, which occurred sometime after the, in the early 1900s, there were many institutions in America, particularly the public schools and churches and other institutions that actively, because there were so many immigrants, they actively promoted a culture of Americanization, so that the children of immigrants would be schooled together and speaking the same language and adopting certain common touchstones of culture through the educational process primarily, that they started out as children of immigrants from different parts of the world and came out as Americans. And I think that we have lost some of that Americanization process in our country for a couple different reasons. I mean, I don't want to overstate it because but I do see us having moved in this direction some. 100 years ago, immigrants came from different parts of the country, and there was, with the exception of people coming from Mexico, there was, you know, a lot of different languages that people were speaking coming from a lot of different parts of the world. Now, overwhelmingly, a very large share of immigrants come from Mexico, Central America, and Spanish-speaking South America. And it's a much larger percentage of our immigration flow than it was in the past. And I think there's a legitimate concern about whether the fact that there are so many immigrants coming from one particular language group and part of the world, whether that means, whether that is slowing down the process of Americanization. I don't think I'm necessarily convinced that it has, but I think that it's a legitimate concern. Particularly when some of my colleagues, and I'm not really the best person to talk about this because I have a colleague who works primarily with Census Bureau data and studies this question more thoroughly and is more familiar with the data. But we have become concerned that there is less upward economic movement among immigrants than there has been in previous times of high immigration. And that some of that may correspond to the languages, to the fact that people are not as well versed in English. They're not acquiring English, high English language skills as quickly as happened in previous generations of immigrants. And you know, I think that's something to be concerned about. I'm not saying that it's a crisis necessarily, but we need to be worried if there are certain groups of immigrants who, for perhaps a variety of reasons, are not able to acquire the skills they need to become self-sufficient and contributing to the extent that they would like to and that we would like them to be able to. And I think that some of it does have to do with language enclaves.
Okay. My next question is actually about undocumented immigrants versus refugees. Should they be treated equal in the migration process to the United States? Undocumented immigrants and refugees.
Did you want me to answer
Either.
first or Michael?
I don't think you can. I mean, I don't think you can treat an undocumented refugee, undocumented immigrant differently than a refugee, in the sense that the refugee, if again, I'm parsing words,
yeah,
if the refugee has already been determined to be a person who fits the criteria of a person who's going to be persecuted at home on account of race, religion, nationality, or membership in a particular social group, you've already decided to give that person shelter. You have an undocumented immigrant who has come into the United States at some point and has established or not established themselves in a flow of a particular society. The refugee, you have done your due diligence prior to their arrival, and you, as best as you can, based on the country conditions and the data and your fingerprint data and international data, have cleared that person as best you can. You have, I think we may or may not be able to agree, there's about 11 million undocumented non-citizens sitting in the United States right now. There's a greater percentage than we may imagine of those who actually came on a visa and then overstayed than we would like to believe that is the caravan of folks coming from the South. But we still have a large population of undocumented immigrants in the United States that we have yet to identify. And we have no viable means for doing that. I mean, we can set up mousetraps in jails, and if you get your fingerprints taken, then we have an idea of who you say you are. But from a cohesive plan to identify and filter 11 million people, we don't have one because we can't get there for politics reasons. You get one side of the table screaming amnesty, and you get the other side of the table saying, we're not going to do anything until we get a path to citizenship, and you get nothing but deadlock in the middle. I think the greatest problem is you have an unknown factor and you have a known quantity. Your unknown factor is the undocumented immigrant. Your known factor is that refugee that you've put through a background process and said, okay, we recognize the plight that you're in, and we're going to give you a seat at the table. Mm-hmm. And I think in that regard, they remain different.
Yeah.
Yes, I would agree. I mean, refugees are a particular category of humanitarian immigration that are chosen in coordination with the United Nations and who come from overseas. I think you maybe were referring to more asylum seekers.
Yeah, perhaps.
Who often arrive on our doormat without, a visa. And so they're, and sometimes they arrive illegally and make a claim for asylum. We do have a process. I mean, under the law, asylum can only be granted to people who can demonstrate a fear of, or a well-founded fear of, persecution on the basis of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or in what's called a particular social group. So and this is actually one of the most vexing areas of policy for the Trump administration right now, is that a very large percentage of the people who are arriving at the southern border, either at the legal ports of entry without a visa, or who are being apprehended by the Border Patrol, are saying that they're here to claim asylum. And you see this in interviews with people with, Michael mentioned the so-called caravan of people who are coming up. Their intention was to get here and make a claim of asylum, because basically word has gotten around that if you get here and are able to set foot on U.S. soil and claim asylum, that you will be given a notice, you will be given an interview to establish something known as credible fear of persecution, and that the standards for that have been very lenient. In recent years, almost 90% of the people who said that they had a fear of persecution were allowed into the country to pursue that claim of asylum, but there were so many people doing it that the immigration court system has become clogged now with a backlog of about 700,000 cases, and people are able to live here for years before their hearing ever comes up. And under the law, once you've been here for 6 months with an asylum claim, you're given a work permit, so you're allowed to work in the country legally. And so this has become a very big incentive for people to get here and claim asylum. Last no, 2 years ago, I was down at our busiest port of entry, which is known as San Isidro, south of San Diego. And they had a line of people. They had a dedicated line in this huge port of entry simply for asylum seekers, for people who would just line up every day and walk up to the port of entry and say, I'm here to claim asylum. I have a fear of return. And under the current interpretation of the law, the Customs and Border Protection had no choice but to let them come in, give them a court date, and hope that they show up for their hearing years in the future. And in fact, the court statistics show that there is a very high rate of people who fail to appear for they simply skip out on their hearings. About half of them, actually, half of people claiming asylum. And that leads to, I think, a legitimate concern that people are doing this not because they actually fear return, but because they've heard that they can get away with it. And so that's why I expect to see that this is a question that the Trump administration has asked Congress to look at our laws on how we handle asylum seekers and see if there's some way to change this dynamic. As was happened under the Clinton administration in 1995, that was the last time we did an overhaul of our asylum laws, because we had a kind of similar situation happening at Kennedy Airport in the East Coast.
I think you both raised an interesting point, which is that most people who are here illegally come here originally legally. What can we do to address that?
Well, it's actually, we don't know exactly how many. We think it's 40% or so of the population of people here illegally.
A fair amount.
Yeah, it's a big chunk, absolutely. Arrived on a visa or a visa waiver. What can we do about that? I think the best way to address that would be to do a better job at discouraging employers from hiring people who are not authorized to work here. I think most experts agree that the main reason people come here is to work. And as long as employers can get away with hiring them, even if they're not authorized, they're going to keep doing it for a variety of reasons. And as long as people believe that they can get a job here and be able to live here and be better off, they're going to keep doing it. So we have to address that job magnet. I think that's the best way to address overstay. I think we should have an exit tracking system too, so that we actually know how many people haven't left. The most recent year, the Department of Homeland Security counted about 500,000 people in 2016 who arrived on a temporary visa, not counting some of the work visa categories, but didn't leave at the expiration of their authorized duration of stay. The time, they didn't leave when they were supposed to. I think some of them did drift out eventually, but that's a huge number of people.
So let's back up a couple steps. Asylum seekers at the border, if we take a global perspective of asylum and refugee law, I think everybody, if I say refugee, you think Syria, because that's the most current one in play. We have 3 countries in crisis in Central America: Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. We can have a whole nother session on what the American responsibility is for the crises that are going on there and how long we've played in their politics over the years, from Iran-Contra to the Civil War and ignoring Guatemala. Having set that aside, we have 3 countries in a state of abject poverty that are not in a civil war, but they might as well be, based on the rise of transnational criminal organizations, the fancy word for the street gangs that have taken them over. Guatemala, Honduras have handled it in a certain way. El Salvador has begun to politicize their gangs. So you have 2 separate gangs that are now politically minded. The irony is that El Salvador had a civil war in which the guerrillas are now the people that are in power in El Salvador. So I don't know if in another 20 years you're going to have a guy with an MS-13 on his face that's the president of El Salvador. But it's certainly possible, because that's the politic. But what we have are refugees. These people are refugees. They're fleeing a conflict that's not unlike a war in Syria, that is a militarized assault on people in those countries. But there's a greater issue. You also have societal issues. If we're to stratify people based on their access to the things that we consider to be life, near to the bottom of that strata might be the Dalits of India, the untouchables, and indigenous women from Central America. But yet, if I want to make a claim that an indigenous woman is persecuted on account of a particular social group, and a particular social group is an immutable characteristic, immutable to that human being, that society views in a particular way. If I want to raise women, Katie bar the door, the alarms, bells go off. I've opened the floodgates. Every woman in the world is going to come to the United States. If I raise indigenous women, if I say, okay, we're going to back off, we go to indigenous women, well, they're not being persecuted on account of that. Absolutely they are. If you look at the culture and structure of those countries, those women are absolutely being persecuted on account of the fact that they're indigenous women, and they are disposable. The rates of femicide are going through the roof. So when they come to the border, and they're carrying a child, and they tell you about how they were treated in their country, that person is a refugee. What do? We put them in jail. We hold them in jail. How long do we hold them? Months? Years? I've had a client held a year and a half. How long are we going to hold those people in jail at the border, in private jails? Yes, you have a credible fear. You pass the credible fear, depending on where you are on that long stretch of border, you may be released once your credible fear is given, and you've passed your credible fear. You may get out of custody. And now you get your notice to appear, you're going to see an immigration judge. If you make it to that first hearing and you do show up, then you get it set for a next hearing, and then you're going to get set for trial. If the immigration judge, or if you do not file that asylum application, and it doesn't sit for 150 days, it has to sit without being touched for 150 days, then you can apply for a work card. If you don't know to do that, and you show up at your next hearing, because that's what the piece of paper says, but you didn't file your work card, you're not going to get one. Because your next hearing is going to get set, or you have to take the next available hearing for your trial. You may never get a work card, depending on the way things move, regardless of where it is. If you make the decision to say, oh no, I want a continuance, well, that cuts against you. That turns your clock off, because it's literally called an asylum clock. How do we keep people that are coming here and they abandon their visa and they disappear into the woodwork to go work? I think that employment is a huge problem. It really angers my conservative Facebook friends when they put a picture of Reagan up and go, we need Reagan. And I go, yeah, because we need an asylum or an amnesty. And they go, no, that's not what I meant. And I go, but he did. He gave us amnesty. But if you look at Reagan's amnesty, he was right, because it was a balance. He drew a temporal line in the sand. He said, you have to be here since this time, you have to be non-criminal, and I'll give you a green card. He was generous. He was giving out green cards. But he also created a phone number, because this is the 80s. He said, employers, call that number, and you read them the Social Security number of that employee you hired. And if it's not right, if it's not good and we can't check it, you can't hire them. But how did we enforce that? Well, we didn't. I was in law enforcement in the 80s, from 1985 till 2000. You could call immigration and say, I have 20 people in the back of a truck. Did they commit a crime? Well, it's 20 people in the back of a truck, but not really. And they'd go, we don't care, because they were focused on criminal aliens. And those people were allowed to remain in the United States. The problem is in this sense, nobody enforced Reagan's telephone number. Who contributes more to political campaigns, the worker or the employer? There was no enforcement of it. There's very little enforcement of it now. But the problem is now we've got a culture of people that don't want to do menial labor. Anybody here who's a graduate or getting ready to graduate from KU, you're ready to take that $17 an hour job at a dairy farm or a calving farm or a feedlot in western Kansas. They've got great benefits. And They might even give you cheap housing because, well, basically they're the only employer in that county. High school, I'll drop it back to high school students. Anybody going to head out there? Hell, is anybody going to work at a restaurant in town? No, we're not. We have a cultural shift in that manual labor. And we can talk about eradicating that and eradicating those avenues and closing down those employers, but then who's going to milk the cow? Because nobody in this room is going to, and there's no shame in that, but no one in this room is going to milk that cow. So the question is who's going to milk the cows for now? And if we say, then, okay, we need labor, then how are we going to get it? H-2A won't do it. An H-2A visa is a non-immigrant visa for farm work, except it's limited to countries. It's not, you can't get it from Central and South America, and it's seasonal. Calving, milking cows is not seasonal. It doesn't work that way. So we don't have a mechanism to replace that labor. And until we have a dialogue about the mechanics of it, how it works, we strip it down to the bare bones and say, this is how this works, where's that labor pool going to come from? We're not going to get there.
No, you're right. Who's going to milk those cows? In parts of the country where there are not a lot of illegal workers, Americans milk those cows. Where I used to live in Vermont, Americans milk those cows. And they're glad to have the work. And they don't, and they get upset if there are dairy farm operators who bypass local workers to hire illegal workers because they can get away with paying them less and the work conditions are unfavorable, not acceptable. And this is when, a little bit earlier I said, our immigration policies have winners and losers. The losers may not necessarily be college graduates like are in this room. The concern I have is that illegal immigration, and to a certain extent our legal immigration system, does displace those Americans who, and legal immigrants who, for whatever reason, haven't had the opportunity to get a college education and would like to have jobs in construction or landscaping or restaurants or manufacturing or some of the other types of jobs that they are forced to compete with illegal workers to get, and sometimes are displaced, never have a chance to actually apply for those jobs. There's no such thing as a job an American won't do. No, there isn't, because we've actually looked in this. Actually, there are 4 jobs that are not majority U.S. citizen. And those are, does anyone guess what they are? If you look in the Census Bureau and see, they keep track of who works in what type of jobs. There are only 4 jobs in the country. If somebody thinks they know which 4 they are, I know which 4. Roofing is not one of them. Most roofers are Americans. They are tailor, nail salon, produce sorter, and welder. Those are the only 4 jobs that are majority non-citizen in the country. And maybe, folks in this room don't want to be a roofer, but I can assure you that there are plenty of people near where I live in cities like New Bedford, Massachusetts, and Boston, Massachusetts, and Baltimore, Maryland, and other places where they're not going to college and they would like to have a job as a roofer, but they don't get the opportunity to. So that's, I think that is a problem that needs to be reconciled. That right now our economy is booming and the unemployment rate has gone down, but our underemployment rate and the rate of people who've dropped out of the labor force is still very concerning. And so, we need to think about how we can bring those people back to the labor force. And I think adjusting our immigration policies and our guest worker programs would help. It's not a silver bullet, but it would help.
Okay, I'm going to ask one last question and then I'm going to open it up to audience questions. You both talked about how, one, things haven't changed a lot in the system and things aren't likely to change. Are there any changes that we can see that are coming in
I know, I have the same, unfortunately. The one area where we might see a change is some kind of legislation on DACA, the group of people who have deferred action for childhood arrivals. It's going to be difficult. We already saw Senate, crash and burn on that earlier this year. Congress can't get out of its own way right now. It's dysfunctional. We have gridlock, and so I'm not hopeful. But I would like to see something done there. We're working on it.
Okay, I'm going to open it up for questions. There's one right here.
Just yes.
Yeah.
Thank you both so much for being here today. I was going to ask to see if I can get your perspective on the quota system and if there'd be a way to rework that, maybe not by nationality, but by type of people you come in on or by the diversity in the U.S.
I mean, it already is to some degree. You've divided it between EB 1s, 2s, and 3s. So you've divided it by skill level. You divide it by country because of the number of applications, Philippines, China, India, Mexico, and everybody else in the entire world. So I think the question becomes is, we get into a battle, we want to do away with the diversity lottery, but that's what brings in, besides student visas, the greatest number of African and arguably Eastern European immigration at this point. So, I mean, I think anything is tweakable. We can begin to filter it any way we want. I think the greater part is that we don't have a lower skilled area for that visa. It's not functional at the lower skills. When you start to look at employment immigration to the United States, you look at a bachelor's degree on up, unless you're talking of an H-2B, which is the landscaping seasonal work visa. So how do we begin to accommodate, unless we're going to bring everybody from New Bedford out to Western Kansas to work for my cabbers for $25 an hour, I don't know how we're going to get there because Western Kansas has got to have that labor, and that's the only way they're going to get it. So we've got to figure out a way to rework that to some degree.
I forgot to mention, in Vermont, they also use machines to milk cows, like they do in Europe, so they don't need people. But yeah, I think we definitely need to revisit our legal immigration categories, and that's why I would very much like to see legislation that would offer a green card and a path to citizenship to the people who have DACA in exchange for trimming back some of the legal immigration categories to offset those numbers, and also change our employment-based immigration system to be less tied to employers and more tied to the skills that people bring, so that people can, so that it would be a little bit more diverse than we have it now. But yeah, absolutely. But the problem is Congress is gridlocked. So and the reforms to the legal immigration system got the least number of votes in the Senate this last time around, so I think that's the least likely area that we're likely to see reform, if that makes sense.
Yes. Okay, much of the discussion tonight focused on refugees and assimilation and illegal immigration. My question pertains to legal immigration. Since 1972, there have been, I believe, 3 government commissions: the Rockefeller Commission, the President Clinton's Council on Sustainable Development, and the U.S. Commission on Immigration Reform, which all of which found that it would be in the interest of the United States to have zero population growth or even negative population growth, that for our long-term ecological and economic interests. 2 of those panels, the ones in the 90s, Clinton's panel and the U.S. Commission on Immigration Reform, specifically addressed immigration's role in that, specifically that U.S. birth rate has been sub-replacement since 1972, so we were almost there with the Rockefeller Commission's role, but immigration is mainly the cause of all long-term U.S. population growth right now. Given that, I would like to know what the panelists think an optimal legal immigration level is for the United States.
I think the problem with the optimal legal immigration is how are we going to do it? If we leave, and I'm not going to pick a side this time, if we leave family-based in play, where do you draw a line? I mean, as long as you have a family member that fits in that category and you want to apply, then they get to come. If we're going to leave it in play as it is now, if you apply for your brother and he has a wife and 2 kids, they all get to come. So if we're going to leave that in play, I don't know that we can put a cap on it. I think the second piece becomes is when we talk about labor, how many do we need? Do we need, as I seem to hear you saying, when we want to parse this into job skills, do we need as many computer programmers as we're getting, or do we need more welders and diesel mechanics and machine operators, or are we going to, or scientists or whatever? I mean, it's become so ridiculously difficult to go from an F to an H, so a student visa to a non-immigrant visa worker these days based on changes in thought. We're getting people that come and take the education and then leave. So I think the problem's going to become is how many workers do we need? And then that's going to dictate that because you're going to get the worker and the family. And then what are we going to do about family immigration? So I'm afraid I don't have a really good answer because I don't have a grasp on what numbers we think we're going to need. And then I think we're going to get as many numbers as we have people in this room. That would be my answer to your question, which is a crappy answer, but that's the only one I got. Sorry.
Yeah, it's astounding that those 3 presidential commissions that you mentioned did fantastic work, very rigorous scholarship on the population issue and immigration's role in our population growth, and yet nothing was ever done on any of them. I support the recommendations of the Jordan Commission, which called for cutting back family-based immigration and endorsed a level that would leave us at about half the rate of legal immigration that we have today, at about somewhere around 500,000. I think we could maybe be a little bit higher than that. If you cut the category for brothers and sisters of U.S. citizens and grown married sons and daughters of citizens and restrained the parents category and got rid of the visa lottery and trimmed back in some other ways, you could get there, and I think that would do a lot to stabilize our I don't see any benefit of the United States having more people than it already does. I mean, I like people, but it's hard to argue that it's a benefit to our country to get a lot bigger than we already are, and immigration is the main driver behind U.S. population growth. I don't know that there's a perfect number, but that's what Congress's job is, to set that number, and once we set the number, we need to stick to it, because that's what makes our legal immigration system have integrity, is, as Barbara Jordan said, those that we say are allowed to come in should be able to come in without a lot of fuss. Those who should not are not allowed in, and anyone here illegally has to be made to leave, and I think that's common sense.
Right here. And try to speak up.
Sorry if this is a little bit long. I'm going to try to provide some context. So I think since 9/11, really, we've really put a lot of money into the law enforcement approach to illegal immigration, ICE and CBP. And on their websites, they kind of promote their goals as being to reduce crime and to stop terrorists and to protect the American people. However, it's kind of hard to achieve these goals because the majority of immigrants and also the majority of people we deport are
The question is basically, is a law enforcement strategy to combat illegal immigration effective, and what could we otherwise be doing?
So this is one of my new projects, shall we say. So let me give you some context. The guy that comes out to your house and tells you that your lawn is 5 inches tall is the code enforcement officer for whatever city you live in. And when he writes you that notice makes you go to a code enforcement court where you pay a fine and you agree to mow your lawn. That is a civil administrative law of that town or that county that you live in. And that code enforcement officer could not jerk you out of your criminal trial or your child custody hearing to go mow your lawn. He didn't have that power. He's just a civil authoritarian. Yet, immigration, the agents who are enforcing the immigration law in which they issue a notice to appear and they put you in removal proceedings to have you see an immigration judge, are enforcing a federal civil administrative law. Legally, it's the same equivalent as the guy that tells you how tall your grass is. The problem is that they take you out of your criminal trial, which you now don't get to finish. So now you're held in immigration court, you're in immigration custody, trying to get bond out of immigration custody. There's a whole irony to say that the immigration judge can deny you bond from immigration custody where, based on the very crime that you just got bond on from the criminal trial, you can't go back and finish your criminal trial because you're in immigration custody and you now can't get out. You may have relief, but the minute you get relief, or you may get the relief denied because you now have a warrant out for you. So the civil immigration process has begun to infiltrate the American jurisprudence, our constitutionally protected criminal justice system, to a degree that is almost catastrophic. That's a pretty strong word. In a county in Kansas where the court posts time in both Mountain and Central Standard Time, it's that far west, a young man was accused of a terrible crime against a young girl. And so he was arrested, he was put in jail, and he was given a very high bond. And he posted that bond. And he had an ICE detainer. And immigration came and got him, and they took him to Wichita to process him. And he said, yes, indeed, you deport me. I don't want to go to jail. I don't want to do this. Just go ahead and deport me. Immigration said, sure, fine. Not a problem. And then the county went, hang on a minute. We'd like to prosecute that young man. Give him back. So ICE went, okay. But if we give him back, you can't let him go. And the county went, sure, that's fine. We won't let him go. So they took him all the way back out to the far western reaches of Kansas, and they put him in jail. But he paid a bond. The bond hadn't been revoked. The criminal court system had released him. That jail he was in is not an ICE jail. The ICE detainer that's holding him is merely a piece of paper with no legal authority. The jailer, the sheriff of that county, had not signed a 287G agreement, a legally binding agreement to deputize one of his officers with a federal commission. So he had no authority to arrest that young man on a federal civil violation and detain him for 2 weeks. The public defender gave me a call and said, what do I do? I said, you file a habeas. You demand his release because there's no constitutional authority to hold that young man in jail. I'm not passing judgment on the heinousness or the non-heinousness of that young man's criminal act. That's not my point. My point is constitutionally, that young man had no business being in jail. And if he's going to be in jail, you're going to be in jail. If we're going to stretch the Constitution, it's going to continue to get stretched. At some point, we have to say, no, you can't do that. So the civil authoritarian law enforcement action that ICE is engaging in is a tuna net that's not dolphin safe. You're not catching criminals. You're catching people with no driver's license. You're catching people that haven't committed crimes, but are being statisticized, well, that's a bad word, counted as a statistic to say they are criminal aliens because we got them from jail. It doesn't necessarily work to solve the problem. It inflames fears in the community. It causes people not to contact law enforcement because we don't have a good solution. It works. Don't get me wrong, President Obama worked wonders with his ICE enforcement aspect of immigration. He created the program of secure communities, which has been reinstated under the current president and the current administration, and it's very effective at filtering people out of county jails and putting them in front of ICE. But it's not effective at necessarily identifying non-citizens. Each time you interfere with the criminal justice system, you're weakening the criminal justice system. And the question is how long are we going to do that? And what's that balance going to be? And I missed your bonus question because I went on a rant. I find a lot of people who are starting to weigh and balance character versus the immigration system. And by that I mean, that's a good person. I want that person to stay in my community because I know the character of that human being. And to me, to that person, that character of that human being is more important than a civil process. There should be a way that that character should be allowed to remain. That character should count for something. And that is starting to be, it's always been a cry. It used to be in the early days of our practice, a farmer or a guy would go, this is a good old boy, I need to keep him. Well, there's no way to keep him. There's no mechanism in the law. But I'm seeing it on a larger and larger scale to say the character matters more than the process. So the process needs to change to allow the character to remain.
Yes, you know, the ICE and Border Patrol, they're badged federal officers, law enforcement officers. You know, the vast majority of ICE's caseload is people who've been convicted of crimes being deported. Not all of them, but that's the majority of their caseload, and I think that's appropriate. I mean, you're right. Non-citizens are no more or less likely to commit crimes than anybody else, but unfortunately there's a small fraction of the population of immigrants here who have committed crimes, and they should be the top priority for deportation and you know, forced deportation. There can be all types, you know, it could be immigration fraud, it could be drunk driving, it could be you know, shoplift, you know, whatever, or, you know, more serious crimes as well, obviously. But illegal immigration is a problem that we can't deport our way out of. I mean, we do have somewhere between 11 and 12 million people living in the country illegally. And while many of them may have a good case, not many, some of them may have a good case to be able to stay, I think it's important to preserve the integrity of our legal immigration system by enforcing the rules. And that's why I think addressing this problem of illegal employment is likely to be the most effective in reducing the problem of illegal immigration, because when people can't get a job, can't get a driver's license, can't live here as if they were here legally, then fewer people are going to try to come here illegally, and many of the people who are here illegally will decide that it's not worth staying here. But I do, you know, while most, like I said, only a small fraction of illegal immigrants are causing problems in a criminal way here, the presence of such a large population of people here illegally does cause other problems like distortions in the labor force and fiscal issues. You know, it's a fiscal burden on American communities, and you know, it's just to say that someone has good character and is a nice person, I'm sorry, that's just doesn't qualify someone to be a legal immigrant just because they're a nice person. And that's, you know, we can't take all the nice people in the world to come here as immigrants. Congress has set up a legal immigration system, and we need, you know, in order for those rules to have meaning for legal immigrants, we have to enforce them. And some of the people who are breaking those laws now, I know are fine people, but that doesn't mean they necessarily get to stay here. And that's why, you know, but I don't necessarily think that means we need to send someone to their home to arrest them and detain them either. I think there's another way that we can encourage compliance with our laws than forcibly enforcing them. If that makes sense.
Okay, we'll do 2 more questions. We'll start in the back.
I just heard that illegal immigration sometimes appreciates wages for legal immigrants because they take a lot of the jobs that legal immigrants would otherwise get. And I just wanted to ask you guys whether or not you thought that was true, and if that was one of the or not allowing for not addressing.
Our research has shown that that often is the case, that legal immigrants are among those most affected by the competition for jobs, and that tends to drive wages down because they're often looking for the same type of work.
I don't have a research division, but the employers that come to my office will pay you more than the minimum wage to do a crappy job. I'm not kidding when I say I've got farmers in western Kansas that'll pay you $25 an hour to help them calve cows, and they don't care what your degree is. They don't care what the color of your skin is. They want you to work. And they would love to have a farm load of Americans who all spoke English and et cetera, but they don't. But they are desperate for folks to do that. I've got tile setters who say I pay $18 an hour for whoever's going to come that can set tile. And in that regard, that wage strata is unaffected by status one way or the other. The problem is that you have very little in the way of a lawful mechanism for a tile setter to come to the United States. Maybe you get a stucco finisher because we can point to that and say that's an extraordinary skill, but for a guy to set tile, I don't think there's a world championship for tile setters that I'm going to get an O visa for. So in that regard, my anecdotal experience doesn't seem to belie that. And you're talking about that, a pinprick perspective from my office, but the folks that come to me and say, this is what I need, or this is what's going on, or I'm now in an I-9 investigation, these are the people that I've been hiring. The wages they're paying are comparable to market.
Go ahead, sir.
Say that laws have to be followed, rules need to be enforced. You know that 40% of all the illegal immigration what are your recommendations or what would you like to see to streamline the process so that the court system is not so backed up? Because I'd love for them to tell me that you can come back to my speeding ticket 4 years from now. I'm not going to show up.
My individual court dates are 2021 right now. So you're you've got plenty of time to save for that speeding ticket in my court.
Well, there's a program available that allows employers to check that new hires are work authorized. It's called E-Verify. It's free to employers, and my personal opinion is that it ought to be mandatory for every employer to run their new hires through E-Verify and to make sure that they're work authorized. That would go a long way if we enforced our laws against identity theft and really did a better job of detecting when people have stolen the identity of someone in order to use it to get a job. You know, that would help a lot to automate that process more. And I think educate employers on, the ways that they can meet their labor needs in other ways besides simply, hiring illegal workers.
Okay, here's my solution that nobody will buy, right or left. And the problem is it doesn't make anybody happy. So we've got 11 million people in the United States and we don't know who they are. That's kind of a problem, don't you think? I mean, if you came home and there was a person sitting at your dining table and you went hi and they went hi, but you didn't know who they were and they're sitting at your dining table, don't you want to know who's at your dining room table? I mean, that's kind of a thing, right? So we got 11 million people in the United States. So we're going to draw a line in the sand, and the temporal line in the sand. We've got a time frame to have been here. It's going to look. This program is going to look a lot like the DACA program. Temporal line in the sand, criminality. Pick it. One DUI, 2 DUIs, domestic violence. What crimes are we going to say are no? Put them on the list. Those crimes are no. So now we've got a temporal line in the sand, and we've got criminality. But we're not going to give them a work card. We're going to give them a visa. So we got them a visa. Why do we give them a visa? Because some people have been in the United States for more than 10 years. Some of them have been less than 10 years, but they haven't seen their families. They'd really like to go see their family. So we're going to give them a visa that allows them to come and go. Why? Because we get to see them come and go. We swipe their passports coming. We swipe them going. We have another check to say who they are. We have another point of entry for them to do something wrong at. It's just another way to check them in the system. But we're going to make them pay for that. Let's say $2,000. And if they've got family members that they're going to put on that, it's $500 a head. So we're going to charge them for that. And we're going to let them do that for 1 or 2 cycles. And why are we going to do that? Because it causes them to repeat that cycle. So now we've built in length of time in the United States. We've built in a criminality aspect. We make them repeat it because we now get to check them, and if they commit a crime later, they're out of the program. We're going to repeat it so that we see that they have some kind of responsibility to come back and do it. They don't just take one card and run off. So now that we've gotten them in that cycle, we're going to get maybe half of them. Let's say we get 6 million because of our criminality component. Because if we even put 1 DUI and 1 domestic violence on there, we're going to knock a lot of people out. Because DUI has no statutory effect on your immigrant status. It does make you a priority for things. And we can sit around all day and talk about whether or not one person has a DUI or not, but we can all recognize that driving drunk in a 2,000-pound automobile is a really bad idea, and it's a really great way to hurt somebody. And we know that it does. So there's no excuse to say, well, but Tom, he's a citizen, he has a DUI. That still doesn't make it right. So whatever we're going to put in criminality, and we're going to run them through this filter. So we've run them a couple of cycles through this filter, and we're going to say, okay, your immigration history is clean from this moment on. Meaning, there are more sand traps in the immigration law to screw up your ability to fix your status than you can imagine. So we have to figure out how to clean those. So now what are you on? You're admitted to the United States in your visa status, and you can get a green card from that. How do you get a green card from that? The same way anybody else does. But you're in status now, so you can. You now have the ability to do that. You don't have to. You can keep keeping your visa for as much time as you want to, or if your boss wants to get you a green card, or your spouse wants to get you a green card, you get in the same line as everybody else. It's not really a line, so I hate to perpetuate that soundbite, but we've now identified half of you. The rest of you, well, you've got the rest of the immigration system to deal with. Whether your spouse fixes you through a normal system or you're not fixable, that may be. But we've got to start cutting some losses. So this is where I'm getting unpopular on one side of the fence. I was already unpopular because I just proposed that on the other side of the fence. So we've dealt with half that population.
It's not a crazy idea. I'm with you.
I know. And so we settled that. That's done. We've done that. We haven't done anything else, but we've done that. Now what are we going to do? Now, I don't disagree with E-Verify. Now, granted, I did try to e-verify myself once and failed. So the system's not perfect, and I was being kind of a literal pain in the butt because it asked me to identify an address, and it said, which one of these is your home? And it was my work address, so I said no, and then it said, well, we can't e-verify you. And I said, well, okay, that makes sense, even though I probably spend more time at my office than I do at my house. But I think if we had a better operating e-verify system, and one that is easier to follow up on, about every 6 months, one of my clients shows up and goes, I can't pass e-verify again. Okay, so I've gotten him his green card. I know he has it. So it didn't get updated in the system the first time. The second time, he only used one of his last names. So it didn't trigger the e-verify system, even though he had his A number, he had his birthday, he had all those other details.
They're actually fixing that this summer.
God, I hope so. I mean, I like him. I don't mind seeing him every once in a while. It just takes about 20 minutes of phone calls to get it fixed. And it does, and we do. But
I mean, the double name thing.
yeah. And I mean, there's enough data that they can make it that we can figure out who you are. If you could do that, then I think Reagan was right. Shut the door. And I'm not above having ICE agents with a ticket book. This is, again, where I start to make one side of the fence more angry than the other. So you have an ICE agent who shows up at your place of business and goes, so show me all your employees. And if you've got an employee that's not on, that hasn't been e-verified or is not checked off in the system, you get a ticket. I'll pick a number, $5,000 a head. How painful do you want to make that? Now, the step after that is we got to figure out what we're going to do with my farmers out in western Kansas. Where's that non-skilled or low-skilled labor going to come from? Unless it's going to come from New Bedford, and I'm all willing to take New Bedford labor out to western Kansas, but I don't know that we got that many people in New Bedford. We're going to have to do something about that low-skilled labor. And how are we going to find that number? Well, we take a census. Not the census, the bad census that asks people their citizenship, but we take a market census and say how many people are struggling. We listen to the guys running lawn mowing crews. We listen to the folks that are employing that labor on a semi-annual basis and say, okay, we have a cap of 50,000 head. And the H-2B cap is 65, 66 a year, and they're running out like that. So we know there's a demand for low-skilled labor. The H-1B, which is bachelor level, disappeared. It's 65,000. They get 200,000 applications, have to have a lottery. I mean, we've got to look at the labor pool. So once we have a number that we can keep adjusting, and Congress will adjust that number and not yell at each other and throw pencils, then I think we can make a system that works. But you have 11 million people sitting at your dining room table, and you don't know who they are. Don't you really just want to say, who are you? I mean, I do. To me, that makes sense. But it doesn't work because one side of the room wants a path to citizenship, and it doesn't give you one.
There's another thing, though. There are 4 million people in the world who've been sponsored by a family member who have paid money and shown that they have the qualifying family relationship, who are waiting their turn.
They're Filipino, right?
No, a lot of them are Mexican. They come from all over the world.
I was teasing. Filipinos the furthest back.
You know, and this is the problem that I and a lot of other people have with a mass amnesty like that, is that there are lots of people in the world who qualify under our legal immigration system who are patiently waiting their turn. And
I said earlier, Mexico is stagnant. There are portions of the Mexico family immigration chart or visa bulletin that are stagnant. And you're right, you got to do something with them.
Yeah.
I mean, you're being unfair.
Our immigration system offers the opportunity of a green card to more people than can be accommodated within our numerical limits every year.
They're just numbers. Change them.
Well, numbers matter, though, if, you know, to our population and to our country in a lot of ways and to our labor market. So we have to make choices. Our immigration policy is about making choices and recognizing that some people just are not going to be able to come here.
And I'm willing
whether
to,
they're nice people or not.
I'm willing to cut off half of the 11 million. I think you're going to lose easily half, depending on how tough you filter that criminality aspect. And I think if you just did a drug crime, a DUI, and a domestic violence, you'd probably cut off half of them right there.
Wow, I don't think that's a lot of people with crime. I don't think there are that many people who are non-citizens who have, there's not that high a proportion of the non-citizen population that has committed crimes.
Maybe it's just my clients. I mean, I don't know. But,
All right, on that
Is this
note.
what Kansas is like?
no, those are Missouri. It's not Kansas. Kansas people don't do that. It's the guys in
Of
Missouri.
course, I should have known.
All right,
But
thank
New
you
Bedford,
so much.
holy crow.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Thank you, Michael. This was a great conversation. Thank you for great audience questions. I just really quick want to promote 2 things we've added to our schedule. On Wednesday next week at 1:45 p.m., we'll have former Kansas Governor John Carlin. And then on Thursday of next week, we'll have former U.S. Senator Nancy Casaubon Baker at 1:30 p.m. And I think those both will be great. So thank you for coming out tonight.